In this video, I go over some of the important personalities in the history of literary criticism, and I will present some of their important ideas which can help you in understanding their views about literature and about the universe in general. This is just an overview of all these figures and not an in-depth study. So, literary criticism starts centuries ago, especially the systematic study of it began in the 5th century BCE. The Greeks began this systematic study of literary criticism. Some historical accounts date the official birth of literary criticism back to the performance of Aristophanes' comedy play The Frogs, when it was judged as the best play. So judging the play required some kind of criteria, and that obviously required performing criticism. From that moment till present, we have numerous critics who have developed their own ideas about what literature is, how it should be judged, what is good literature, and some other things. So first of all, Plato starts the systematic study of literary criticism. Alfred Whitehead says that all of Western philosophy is but a footnote to Plato. So he laid the foundation of many, if not all, the concepts of Western philosophy. Now, his theory of essence, ideas, or forms is very famous, and his theory about literature also takes its birth from this idea. Now, this idea is that the ultimate reality is spiritual, and the spiritual realm, or the one as he calls it, is composed of ideal forms or absolutes that exist whether or not any mind posits their existence or perceives them. Now, it is these ideal forms that give shape to our physical world, because our material world is nothing more than a shadow or replica of the absolute forms found in the spiritual realm. So he says that our universe or our reality is just a replica or copy of the original spiritual realm, where everything exists in its ideal form, and all art is an imitation. So if our reality is already an imitation of the perfect spiritual realm and poetry imitates reality, then poets are two folds away from the truth. So he says that poet's craft is an inferior who marries an inferior and has inferior offspring. Poets produce their art irrationally, he says, and he condemns all the poets, and he says that they should be banned. But in his later work, he acknowledges the need for poets and their craft to celebrate the victors, but he says that they should be censored. Now, one more thing is that Greeks used a presentational mode for discovering truth, plays and other stuff, but with Plato and his academy, abstract thinking became the mode or the method to reach the truth. Now, Plato and his academy founded a complex theory of literary criticism that initiated the debate which is still ongoing. And then we have his student Aristotle, who emphasizes on the elements of a work instead of the function of the work. So in Poetics, which is the compilation of his lectures, he states the general principles of tragedy, while he also responds to many of Plato's doctrines and arguments. Now, Aristotle agrees with Plato that all art is an imitation, but he disagrees with Plato that poetry is an inferior craft. He says that it is not the function of the poet to relate what has happened, but what may happen. So stating the general, not the particular. So he says that poetry is more philosophical and higher than history, because history relates to specific events while poetry is just stating general truths. So he also says that not all type of imitation is bad. He differentiates between tragedy and comedy. So he says that tragedy is the imitation of better people. He also gives a definition of tragedy through which we can see his contributions to the literary criticism, which are that act of imitating nature gives us pleasure, and art possesses form like beginning, middle, and an end, unlike life. And the universal and not the particular should be stressed, and there should be close attention to diction, to the language of the poetry. It should be elevated language and not the language of common man. According to him, all tragic heroes in the tragedy have a tragic flaw, or what he calls hamartia, that leads to their downfall. Another concept of his is catharsis, which he says that tragedy must have an emotional effect on the audience, and it should move the audience through pity and fear, so that they get catharsis or the emotional purgation or purification. So we can see that Plato focused on the subject matter of poetry and its effects on readers, while Aristotle emphasizes literary form or structure. Now, the third is Horace. Now, his concerns are quite different from Aristotle and Plato. He takes their ideas for granted, and he actually goes on to give practical do's and don'ts for a writer. He says that poets must imitate other poets, especially the classics, and he says that the poets should be writing traditional subjects in unique ways, and that they should be avoiding all the extremes in subject matter, diction, vocabulary, and style. And they also should be trying to follow the examples of classical Greek and Roman authors, but they must keep their sights low, that they should not be trying to be Virgil or Homer. And his one of the important ideas is that poetry's function is to both teach and delight. So it teaches while you get enjoyment, getting taught. And next is Longinus. Well, his date of birth and national origin remains controversial, and his important work is on the sublime, in which he actually borrows from different traditions, and he also defines what a literary classic is. And he says that to accurately judge a literary work, one must be well read. In this work, he also mentions the greatness of literature or the sublimity, and he says that it has 5 key elements: that it has great conceptions or ideas, the power of forming great conceptions, inspired passion, and formation of figures. It has noble diction and dignified and elevated composition. He says that all readers are innately capable of recognizing the sublime because their nature have the ability to do that. Now we see that he emphasizes the author, that the author should be the one who must possess a great mind and a great soul. And he also emphasizes the work itself, that a text must be composed of dignified and elevated diction. And he also stresses the reader response, that the reaction of learned audience in large part determines the value or worth of any given text. So we can say that he is foreshadowing some of the theories of 20th century, like new criticism and reader response criticism, which we will discuss in the upcoming videos. Next is Plotinus. Well, he wrote treatises to articulate the views of Plato, whom he thought to be authority on all the matters. He developed and clearly articulated the most pivotal concept in Plato's philosophy, the one, which is, according to him, unique and absolutely uncomplex, but also absolutely transcendental. And he says that unity with the one is the goal of humanity, and due to that, humanity exists in 3 forms of being: intelligence, soul, and matter. Now, intelligence corresponds with Plato's realm of ideas, where people comprehend ideas and concepts through the intellect and not the senses. Now, the soul is actually overarching soul that runs through all the creation and not just humans. And the matter is the third and lowest mode of being. Now, according to him, matter is at first praiseworthy because creation is able to know the one only because of its overflow into matter. But matter at the same time is also lowest form of existence. So his development of the philosophy of Plato is known as Neoplatonism, and that had been very influential. Then is Dante, whose most famous work is the Divine Comedy, and according to him, the proper language for poetry is the language spoken by people, the vernacular. And until the publication of Dante's work, all works were published in Latin, but he changed all that. And even in his work, he uses multiple levels of interpretation or symbolic meaning, which till his time were only applied to scripture and not other works. Next is Boccaccio, and Boccaccio's poet hero was Dante. He is one of the founders of Renaissance. His most influential work is on the genealogy of the gods of the Gentiles, which is a collection of classical myths and legends, and he focuses primarily on the problem of human condition, which was the hallmark of Renaissance. According to him, myths reflect both truth and reality, and he defends poetry, saying that the purpose of poetry is to improve life by revealing both truth and God. And he also says that poetry comes from the bosom of God, and the truth found by the poet, he says, lies in allegory. And if you don't know, allegory is a work that conveys a hidden meaning through the use of symbolic characters and events. And we have a lot of examples of allegorical writings in children literature. Next is Sir Philip Sidney, who is the first influential literary critic in English history. He formulates the Renaissance literary theory. He is an eclectic critic, means that he borrows and amends others' theories and uses them as he sees fit. Like he says that poetry is an art of imitation, and it is above all other sciences and arts. And he says that poetry's chief function is to teach and delight. Poetry, he says, alone is a teacher of virtue, moving the mind and spirit to both teach and desire to be taught. For Sidney, creative poetry is akin to religion because both of these achieve their purpose by stirring the emotions. He also says that poetry affirms and teaches morality. Next is John Dryden. Well, Dryden embodies the spirit and ideas of the neoclassical period in English literature, and he excelled in almost all the genres, including literary criticism. It is said about Dryden that he brought literary criticism out of the church and into the coffee houses. And one of the important contributions of his is that he develops the study of literature in and of itself, and not in moral or theological sense. So he sees that literature has an intrinsic function or intrinsic importance. He also writes in natural and simple prose style, and like some other critics, he also brings different critical perspectives into the English literary criticism. He also advocates for the establishment of objective principles of criticism upon which the literary works can be judged and evaluated. Joseph Addison acknowledges the superiority of ancient critics over the modern ones, and it is actually a common theme across many of the literary critics that they value ancient critics over their contemporary ones. He also highlights the sublime, or what he calls the greatness of literature, and according to him, that is not about the form of literature but about how the meaning of literature has the power to move humans. that it has the power to display the immensity of life. And according to him, curiosity is one of the most lasting and strongest appetites of humanity, and due to that, a critic's writings must be broad, which should touch on politics, sciences, arts, society, and a lot of other things. He says that the audience of the writer should be general public. Next is Alexander Pope. He was deformed and twisted in his body due to spinal tuberculosis, and with the publication of his essay on criticism, he became literary Pope of England. According to him also, the golden age of criticism is the classical age, and he says that it is the critic and poet's task first to know and then copy these authors and not nature, because according to him, a good poet is a natural genius, then he has the knowledge of the classics, and then he also has the understandings of the rules of poetry, and after all that, he follows strictly some rules, and he gives some of those, like poetic diction should be followed, the proper language of poetry, there should be heroic couplet, and also the personification of abstract ideas. Now we see that Pope grounds his criticism in both mimetic theory, which is the imitation theory, and rhetoric literary theory. Now after that, there were some major shifts in the world due to which the thought patterns of people changed a lot. Like there were some major political rebellions, there was French Revolution, American Revolution. There was also prominent changes in the philosophical thoughts, like the 18th century valued order and reason, as we saw in Alexander Pope, that he was emphasizing on the structures, but 19th century emphasized intuition. People in the 19th century emphasized rural places as fundamental instead of city life. According to them, the truth could be attained by tapping into a core of our humanity or our natures, which are best sought in natural settings and natural environment. And due to that, we see William Wordsworth, with his publication of lyrical ballads in 1798, heralds the beginning of British Romanticism. The major concepts of his theory are found in the preface to Lyrical Ballad, which was published in the next edition of Lyrical Ballads in 1800. Now he revolutionizes a lot of ideas, and he concerns himself with the elements and subject matter of literature. According to him, subject of poetry is common people, not the aristocratic class, and proper language of poetry is the everyday speech, not the elevated or inflated poetic diction. He redefines poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility, and he also redefines the role of poet. He says that poet is the man speaking to men, but he has just more sensibility, more enthusiasm, and more tenderness than the common man. According to him, there is no need to follow the prescribed rules, and the poets can express freely their individualism. According to him, poetry primarily deals with imagination and feelings, and he asks readers to rely on their own feelings and imaginations when reading his poems, and then they can also share the same emotions with him. Now we see that his theories move him away from the previous mimetic and rhetoric theories and towards the expressive school of criticism, which emphasizes the individuality of the artist and the reader's privilege to share in this individuality. Now S.T. Coleridge was his friend, but later he moved away from Wordsworth's ideas and he criticizes his ideas in his book. He says that Wordsworth writes his best poetry when he is furthest away from adherence to his own theories of what poetry should be. And according to him, the language of poetry should be elevated. It should have the aesthetic effect, and it should not be everyday language. Now P.B. Shelley is also one of the most famous romantic poets, and he wrote a defense of poetry in response to an attack on romantic poetry. Now Shelley is by far the greatest devotee of all the romantic poets of Plato and establishes himself as the voice of Neoplatonism in British Romanticism. He adopts and adapts Plato's concepts of forms, and he says that poetry is the best way to gain access to the forms and to the ultimate truths. And according to him, poetry is concerned with the spiritual and transcendental, so poets can lead people to truth and open their minds to the unseen beauty around them which they usually ignore. His contemporary John Keats did not write formal literary theory, but some of his ideas are worth mentioning. Now the idea of unconscious, we see, is an essential one in Romanticism, and Keats too formulates a notion of the workings of the unconscious. His idea of negative capability is also famous and important, which is that when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after the fact and reason. Now George Eliot's critical work ranges widely over classical and continental writers and philosophical issues. Now after her, we see that there are two distinct tracks in the development of English criticism. One track we can say that leads through Samuel Johnson and Matthew Arnold to T.S. Eliot and F.R. Leavis, and which can be called practical criticism track, and this one tends to center upon the close analysis of the work of particular writers and gives us our familiar tradition of close reading, which became known as new criticism. And the other track lies through Sidney, Wordsworth, Coleridge, George Eliot, and Henry James, and this track is very much ideas led rather than text led, means that it tends to tackle big general issues concerned with literature, like how are literary works structured, how they affect readers or audience, and what is the nature of literary language, and so on. Next one is Hippolyte Taine, and now we see that with the rise of the Victorian era in the 1830s, reason, science, and a sense of historical determinism began to replace romanticism's ideas. And we see the fame of Charles Darwin's book on the origin of species, which kind of provided people with certainty that now they know their own origin. And science, it seemed, provided key to everything. Now, Taine is one of those people who is influenced by this a lot. According to him, text is like a fossil which contains the likeness of the author, which means that he considers author the most important. According to him, to understand a text, we should study its environmental influences, which are race, that the people of same race shape emotion, beliefs, and ways of understanding, and milia, which is surroundings and culture, and moment, which is the time period in which that text was written, and the dominant faculty, which is the author's individual talent, which makes him different from the other people around him. Next is Matthew Arnold, and in his time we see that there are oppositions to romanticism and there is more credence to empirical and rationalistic methods, as we saw a moment earlier. What he does is he reapplies the classical criteria to literature, and he borrows a lot of ideas from classical authors. According to him, the best poetry is of a higher truth and seriousness. Literature reflects a society in which it is written. He also attempts to define a classic, and he also cites other classics as well. According to him, poetry and not religion, science, or philosophy is mankind's crowning activity. A critic must view society disinterestedly, objectively, and it should not become a part of political agenda. Now, according to him, the critic's task is to have always in one's mind lines and expressions of the great masters and to apply them as a touchstone to other poetry, which is touchstone theory. But we see that this objectivity in criticism becomes quite subjective, like whose judgment is going to define the classic or whose judgment is going to define what is good or bad in literature. So according to him, the critic functions as an authority on values, culture, and tastes. So he redefines the task of literary critic. Now you can notice that we are mostly talking about poetry, but at this time a lot of novels were also being written, and there was not a body of criticism available for novels. So Henry James comes to the scene and he writes his essay, The Art of Fiction. So according to him, a novel is, in its broadest definition, a personal, a direct impression of life, and the only obligation to which in advance we may hold a novel is that it be interesting. So according to him, a text must be realistic, a representation of life as it is. And he also differentiates between good author and bad author, that unlike bad author, good author knows how to structure the events and how to make it seem more realistic. And he says that good author should not directly tell a story through his omniscient voice and a third person's narrative. Well, almost all of the ideas that I am going to discuss of T.S. Eliot have been controversial. His idea of dissociation of sensibility, which is according to him, the intellectual thought was separated from the experience of feeling in poetry during the course of 17th century. And his idea of impersonality, which is that the best parts of a poet's work are not those which are most original, but those in which the voice of his predecessors can be seen. Means the best work of a poet is which echoes the tradition, not his own individualism. And his idea of objective correlative is that the best way of expressing an emotion is not directly telling it or describing it, but instead presenting it through some symbol, action, or gesture. And this we can see is kind of the ancient distinction between mimesis, which is the imitation, and diegesis, which is narration. Next is F.R. Leavis. Now we can notice some similarities between Arnold and Leavis, and both emphasize that great literature is necessary for a healthy society and culture. And both emphasize that a critic should focus on abstract thinking and have his own way of describing things instead of having an objective criteria, and that he should be open to the qualities of the text without applying again an objective criteria. And as we saw with Matthew Arnold, Leavis also says that poet and critic should be away from politics. But there are some differences as well between Arnold and Leavis ideas, like Arnold takes the reputation of the past writers for granted, while Leavis criticizes a lot of them. While Matthew Arnold wrote for everyday audience, F.R. Leavis shifted the field toward a more rigorous professional type of literary study. So according to him, the most important test of a literary work is whether the writing feels alive, vibrant, and connected to real human experience or not. And Leavis' extreme popularity was partly due to the fact that he kind of combined Johnson's moralism and Arnold's social vision and anti-theoretical critical practice. I.A. Richards was pioneer of decontextualized approach to literature, which became later known as practical criticism in Britain and new criticism in America, which we will study later. Now he presented students and tutors with unannotated anonymous poems for commentary and analysis, which is known as close reading, and it was so famous that it became the norm and the only tradition for a long time. His student was William Empson, and his book was 7 Types of Ambiguity. He also emphasized the ultra close reading of the text, but according to him, the language language was really a very slippery medium which cannot provide us the correct meaning. And in the title of his work, ambiguity could mean verbal difficulty. According to him, when we handle language, we need to be aware that the whole thing is likely to explode into meanings we had not suspected of being there at all. So he kind of anticipates the post-structuralist view about the unreliability of language, which we will also study later. But after some time, he drew back from the linguistic void by stressing the autobiographical context. So that is the end of this video, and in the next one, I will be talking about liberal humanism and the transition to theory, and we'll also discuss some common and shared idea of almost every theory.